welcome back to another episode of Coffee with April. So this time, we're gonna dig into a bit of roasting. You guys see that I have a board in front of me, which normally I don't have. So let's see how that all kind of works out. So concept here is consistency. Now, consistency is one of those things that most people are struggling with when roasting. Consistency is, to be fair, very difficult. One can argue whether we're actually able to be consistent in any kind of way if you look at it on a very kind of micro level. I'm still not convinced that any of us actually are consistent, but there is a few things you need to understand about what you need to cover to be able to be consistent, which I have a feeling that most people are not today. So first of all, one thing that we've been talking about quite often here, and I come back to again and again and again, roast one batch size. Continuously roast one batch size. A bit depending on machine, that batch size can actually change. And in the end of the day, I don't really care if you're at 80% of your capacity or if you're at 25. I would recommend to be closer to 80, but the key thing here is that when you're changing mass in the machine, regardless of what that mass consists of, you're going to end up in a very difficult situation, right? Where you're going to have a different pressure, you're going to have a different heat attribution, and that mass is going to basically absorb energy very differently depending on size, depending on movement as well, depending on a lot of different factors. So to make your life a lot easier, roast one batch size and half of the work is done. However, what happens later? Now, there's a few things that is very, very important that I feel that we're sometimes neglecting. And the key thing here is that the majority of the consistency in your roast is going to be based on what's happening in the later part of your roast, let's say 30% of the remaining roast time. And in between up until starting your next roast, right? Now, this is really basic stuff, so make sure you get this. Now, first of all, here we have a random just burner distribution percentage curve, right? All of you roasting with Cropster will already know what this is. If you don't roast with Cropster, just start roasting with Cropster. It will also make your life a lot easier. But here is, for example, temperature decrease, temperature increase, decrease, and so on, right? Now, the interesting thing here is, and I'm basing this on you having the same batch size, right? So if you don't work with the same batch size, start by working with the same batch size. Then you can move into this, because if you don't do that, you're not ready for this yet. So interesting thing here is that depending on a burner percentage that I'm working with in the later part of the roast, depending on the duration of the later part of the roast, meaning do I have a 2-minute development time after first crack, or do I have a 1 minute, right? Do I have a coffee that reaches 210 end temperature or 205, depending on what kind of probe you have, right? The key thing here is that depending on where you are there, that's gonna actually have a big impact on your previous batch, meaning how much energy am I moving into that? Now, one of the ways to regulate this and keep track to some extent is what we call an in-between protocol. In-between protocols are very simple and it's something that everyone should have. It basically starts with the coffee is coming out of the machine, what do you do? So how long is the door open? What are you doing with your fan system if you have one? What are you doing with your burner if you have one? One can argue that the most important thing is to be consistent. Now, here you're going to stumble into a kind of an issue, because when you're roasting, you also want to be efficient, right? So we don't want to have an in-between time that's 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, right? The reality is to be able to climatize the machine back to neutral, regardless of which roast you have, you probably need a very, very long in-between time, 15, 20, 30 minutes to be fair. But we don't want to do that. We want to be able to roast a lot quicker. So what's happening then is that the in-between times are mainly to, one, clean the machine in the sense that you have a lot of dirty air in the machine. You want to make that air go out, right? So having the door open, having the fire system on could actually help you. Now, the protocols will be different depending on if you have a convective or a conductive roaster. So whether you have an air-based system or a drum-based system, right? Now, we're not going to go into detail. The most important thing here is that you understand the importance of it, start looking at the variables, and then we're going to break down the details in future videos. So the key thing here is that, let's say you have a stable in-between protocol. Let's say your in-between time is, let's say 2 minutes. Doesn't really matter. That can be 3 minutes, that can be 1.5, totally up to you, right? The reality is still, if you're consistent with this will still be extremely important, right? So if you have a curve basically finishing, for example, like this, versus finishing like this, versus the third example here, you're gonna take 3 very different amount of energy into the start of your next roast, right? So this becomes really important because you need to think about how are you planning and structuring your roast schedule, right? Especially in terms of profiling. So you need a process for, okay, when I'm profiling a coffee to have a stable profile that I'm gonna use as my reference curve in the future, you need to look at just as much, okay, so what was this coffee that I was using before as anything else? Because unless you have a coffee with a very similar burner structure and a very similar time during 30% of the later part of the roast, you're not gonna be able to be consistent. So then you're gonna push in your coffee, you're gonna use, whether you use a fully automatic system or whether you actually change those burners yourself, you're gonna wonder, why is this not coming out the way that I want to? Why is this 10 seconds quicker here or slower here? Why do I have a slightly wrong end temperature? The reason for that most of the times is what's happening in the roast previously to the roast that you have done before, because it's too different from the reference you've been setting. Now, don't even get me started on how complicated this will be if you're gonna start mixing in different batch sizes as well. Now, I know some of you are gonna comment, I don't understand why you can't do different batch sizes. And I mean, I'm sorry, if you don't understand that, I can't help you. But start by looking into this and this if you have an issue with being inconsistent. I mean, this you wanna be to just level out the machine as much as you can, even if you can never do that 100%. I will say that a drum roaster is way more difficult in terms of this, since the machine is so slow to adapt because you're building up all of that energy in the drum, and for you to stabilize that energy down to kind of a normal temperature, that's going to take you a very, very long time. I would most likely, on roasting on a pro batter or deedrish, recommend actually cooling down and turning the machine off several times throughout the day to try to kind of maintain some kind of consistency. But the reality is that once those machines are warm and running, there's no flexibility there whatsoever, right? So what's gonna happen is that you're just gonna be able to roast in one single way, and that's about it. Which we could taste on most people using drum roasters as well, whereas the system as a lowering, for example, is a bit more flexible because it's not building up that much conductive heat, right, throughout the roast day. Even then, after, let's say, 20-30 roast, perhaps you should actually turn it off, start again, to be able to be more consistent throughout the roast day, depending on how much you roast. So these were just some very basic breakdowns. I'm gonna bet that most of you that have an issue with your consistency is that you're not roasting the same batch size and you're not factoring in what happened in the roast before, on my burner settings, on my temperatures, on my durations. What did I do with my in-between protocol? Is this consistent? And then you're ready to start the next roast. So thank you very much for tuning in. Again, simple kind of details, basic stuff. We're gonna make it a bit more complicated in the future. If you have any comments, please let us know. Just take a note down here as per usual. And thank you guys for watching.